Yes, I believe the work ethic has been compromised. I believe we're living in the age of entitlement. I believe that it's the wrong training.
Gene Simmons never learned how to stay quiet. At 68, the Kiss frontman looks back on rock history with no filters, no apologies, and no patience for bassists who broke his rules. To Gene, the bass is power, discipline, and control, not flash or ego. And over the years, 7 bassists crossed that line in very different ways. One made the bass impossible to ignore. One barely seemed to want the job. Another challenged everything Gene believed rock should be. And one name will catch you completely off guard. This isn't nostalgia, it's judgment, straight from Gene himself. Number 7. Flea. When Gene Simmons talks about bass, he always starts with one principle: function before flash. To Gene, the bass guitar isn't meant to compete for attention. It's meant to anchor the song, lock in with the drums, and quietly control the energy of the band. That belief alone explains why Flea, the hyper-kinetic bassist of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, represents everything Gene Simmons has openly questioned about modern rock bass. Flea's style is impossible to ignore. Slap bass techniques, rapid-fire runs, constant movement, shirtless performances, wild jumps across the stage. His playing often feels closer to a lead instrument than a rhythmic foundation. For millions of fans, that intensity is exactly what makes the Red Hot Chili Peppers unforgettable. Flea doesn't just play the bass, he performs it. But from Gene Simmons's perspective, that same energy crosses a line, one where the bassist stops serving the song and starts serving himself. Gene has repeatedly expressed disdain for what he sees as musical showboating, especially when it comes from bass players. In his view, the bass should be felt more than heard. It should guide the song without demanding applause. Flea, on the other hand, wants you to hear every note and watch every movement while he plays it. To Gene, that isn't rebellion or innovation, it's ego disguised as expression. What truly separates the two isn't talent. Gene has never seriously denied Flea's technical ability. Even his harshest critics acknowledge Flea's skill, speed, and creativity. The real divide is philosophical. Gene believes rock music works best when it's simple, sexual, and direct. Flea's funk-punk jazz fusion style feels, to Gene, like unnecessary complexity. Where Gene sees discipline as strength, Flea celebrates chaos. Where Gene values consistency, Flea thrives on unpredictability. There's also a generational tension at play. Gene came up in an era where bassists were expected to stay in their lane. The role was supportive, steady, and largely invisible. Flea emerged in a time when rules were meant to be broken, when punk attitude collided with funk virtuosity and stage presence mattered as much as sound. To Gene, that collision didn't elevate the rock, it diluted it. He has often suggested that slap bass in particular turns music into a technical exercise instead of an emotional one. There is also the question of image. Gene Simmons's Kiss was a visual spectacle, although the visuals were expertly managed. Every action was intentional, and every costume had its purpose. Each member of the band was given a distinct part to play. In contrast, Flea's stage character is almost like a revolt. It is rough, unplanned, and erratic. Gene has never felt all that at ease with such disorder, more so if the disturbance comes from the ushering in of the deep sound of the band. To Gene, the bassist is the bass. To Flea, the bassist is a frontman sharing the limelight. The very fact that there is a difference creates tension. To Gene, the bassist, becoming the visual center, means the band's equilibrium is disrupted. It's not that Flea's playing is poor, it's only that Flea violates Gene's no-break rules. Strangely enough, the two men have more in common than what Gene may want to acknowledge. Each man is a force to be reckoned with. They both have an unmistakable presence. They each played a part in shaping their band's sound and image. However, while Gene Simmons sees authority and restraint as the main contributors to the longevity of the bands, Flea embodies the opposite, namely freedom and excess. Thus, in the eyes of Gene, Flea is not a perfect bassist. Rather, he is a warning. The one who illustrates in a loud way that the bass is the least in the background. The one who even breaks the technique with purpose. The one who is all energy and no structure. Yet, to the crowd, he is a pioneer. To Gene Simmons, he is just excessive. And if that one surprised you, the next bassist pushes Gene's patience even further. Number 6. Krist Novoselic. Gene Simmons has always believed that rock musicians should want it. Fame, money, dominance, and cultural control. He never hid his ambition, and he never apologized for it. In Gene's world, hunger is not optional. It's the engine that drives greatness. So when grunge exploded in the early 1990s and Nirvana became the biggest band on the planet, while openly rejecting the very idea of rock stardom, Gene didn't see authenticity. He saw ingratitude. Krist Novoselic's bass playing was intentionally simple. Root notes, steady rhythms, minimal movement, minimal flash. It worked perfectly for Nirvana's raw, distorted sound and gave Kurt Cobain's songs the space they needed to breathe. But to Gene Simmons, that simplicity felt like evidence that standards had collapsed. Gene has often criticized grunge-era musicianship, arguing that success should come from skill, command, and precision, not from posture, attitude, or cultural timing. Krist's playing, in Gene's eyes, symbolized a movement that rewarded apathy over excellence. What irritated Gene even more than the playing was Krist's demeanor. Unlike most rock bassists who crave attention, Krist appeared almost uncomfortable with it. On stage, he rarely pushed himself forward. He didn't project dominance. He didn't command the room. To Gene, that wasn't humility. It was a lack of hunger. Rock music, in Gene's belief system, is about assertion, not withdrawal. Presence matters. Control matters. If you don't look like you want the crown, Gene believes you shouldn't be wearing it. There was also a cultural clash that went far beyond bass lines. Gene Simmons built his career on the idea that rock and roll is supposed to be loud, indulgent, sexual, and unapologetically commercial. Success, in his view, is something to embrace, not apologize for. Nirvana, by contrast, treated success like a burden. Krist openly criticized fame, capitalism, and the music industry, topics Gene has mocked relentlessly over the years. To Gene, biting the hand that feeds you isn't rebellion, it's hypocrisy. From Gene's point of view, Krist Novoselic was not only a bassist of a band that, in a way, turned its back on traditional rock values, but he was also the saying no to the very ways. Gene's viewpoint was that Krist was practically the very opposite of rock and roll. He did not make a big deal out of it, did not show off, did not lure people into the fantasy, did not indulge in the excesses, etc. And for Gene Simmons, who considers rock to be both a kind of art and a form of business, that rock star mentality was about to be almost disrespectful. If rock is a war, Krist didn't behave like a warrior. Gene has often maintained that Nirvana's breakthrough resulted in a new and lower standard in the area of musicianship, as the emotional aspect was able to surpass the technical one. Krist, by his very subdued manner, became an easy target for such a claim. Not because he made wrong notes, but because he played just enough notes. In Gene's universe, just enough is not something you get approval for. It is a sign of being lazy. It indicates being satisfied with where you are and not aspiring for more, rather than being a conqueror. The rift that existed after Nirvana's disbandment between Krist and Gene only got deeper. Krist, to a large extent, got away from the mainstream and popular music. He mainly focused on activism, and the celebrity culture was almost entirely out of his life. He did not pursue a solo career. He wasn't associating himself with the other rock stars Gene would probably have done. To Gene Simmons, that choice was a confirmation of his doubts. A person who is given such a huge opportunity in the history of rock and then opts out must not have been all that interested in it anyway. Gene's problem with Krist was never personal to begin with. The animosity was of an ideological nature. Krist embodied a type of rock that Gene Simmons opposes. one in which the triumph of humility over pride, simplicity over the fancy, and avoidance over the ruling are the main characteristics. For listeners, the image of Krist Novoselic being a bassist for nothing but nirvana comes through, solid, honest, and unpretentious. Gene Simmons, on the other hand, saw in him a bassist lacking the necessary involvement, and that might be the ultimate sin in rock and roll. Number 5. Nikki Sixx. On the surface, Gene Simmons and Nikki Sixx should have been natural allies. Both are bassists. Both are unapologetic self-promoters. Both helped build bands that were as much brands as they were musical acts. But that similarity is exactly why their philosophies collided, and why Gene Simmons has often treated Nikki Sixx as a cautionary example of what happens when image overtakes substance. Gene Simmons has never hidden his belief that musicianship still matters, even in the most theatrical corners of rock music. While he fully embraces spectacle, makeup, shock, and controversy, he insists those elements must rest on discipline and musical competence. To Gene, shock value without structure is hollow, and in his view, Motley Crue often leaned too heavily on chaos, excess, and controversy without earning it musically. Nikki Sixx's bass playing has never been the focal point of Motley Crue's sound. His lines are simple, repetitive, and functional, designed to support the band's image rather than showcase technical skill. For fans, that simplicity works. Motley Crue was never about complexity. It was about attitude. But to Gene Simmons, that minimalism reinforced a long-held criticism that some bassists rely on branding, mythology, and persona to compensate for limited musical range. Gene has publicly criticized what he sees as style-first rock culture, where notoriety replaces mastery. In that context, Nikki Sixx became a symbol of an era where destruction, decadence, and dysfunction often overshadowed musicianship. To Gene, the difference between Kiss and Motley Crue was intent. Kiss engineered chaos with control. Motley Crue lived inside chaos and let it define them. There's also an unspoken rivalry beneath the surface. Nikki Sixx openly admired Gene Simmons early in his career and has acknowledged Kiss as a major influence. But admiration can quickly turn into competition. Gene, who believes he helped invent the blueprint for shock rock success, has little patience for those he feels copied the formula without refining it. In Gene's mind, imitation without evolution is stagnation. Gene has also expressed disdain for glam metal's emphasis on appearance over endurance. He measures legitimacy by longevity. Survival, in his worldview, is proof of discipline. From his perspective, Kiss endured because of planning, restraint, and ruthless control. Nikki Sixx's very public struggles with addiction only reinforced Gene's belief that chaos eventually consumes itself. Rock stars who lose control, Gene believes, surrender power. What truly separates the two men is accountability. Gene Simmons believes leadership means responsibility, not just to fans, but to the entire machine behind the music. Nikki Sixx, by contrast, embraced self-destruction as part of his mythos. His personal collapse became part of the story, woven into the band's identity. To Gene, that wasn't honesty. It was irresponsibility disguised as authenticity. Still, Gene has never completely dismissed Nikki Sixx's impact. He recognizes Motley Crue's influence on hard rock and acknowledges their massive cultural footprint. But respect, in Gene's mind, is not the same as approval. Influence alone doesn't excuse what he sees as shortcuts. Fame without foundation, Gene believes, is temporary, even if it feels eternal in the moment. To Gene Simmons, Nikki Sixx represents a bassist who mastered branding better than bass playing, a musician who prioritized image over growth, chaos over control, and legend over longevity, someone who built an empire on attitude rather than authority. To fans, Nikki Sixx is a survivor who turned excess into art and lived to tell the story. To Gene Simmons, he's a reminder that spectacle without substance eventually runs out of fuel. Number 4. Geddy Lee. Of all the musicians Gene Simmons has ever criticized, Geddy Lee may be the most paradoxical. Unlike others on this list, Geddy's issue was never a lack of talent, ambition, or discipline. In fact, it was quite the opposite. To Gene Simmons, Geddy Lee was almost too good, too technical, too cerebral, too refined for what Gene believes rock music is supposed to be at its core. Gene Simmons has long argued that rock and roll works best when it's simple, primal, and accessible. In his philosophy, complexity is the enemy of mass appeal. 3 chords, a strong hook, a clear, direct message. That's the formula Gene trusts and built an empire on. Rush, led musically by Geddy Lee, shattered that formula at every turn. Instead of simplicity, they leaned into precision. Instead of instinct, they leaned into intellect. Geddy's bass playing is famously intricate. Odd time signatures, rapid-fire note changes, melodic runs that weave around the guitar and drums, and an almost scientific level of precision defined Rush's sound. Among musicians, Geddy is widely regarded as a virtuoso, someone who expanded what the bass guitar could do in a rock setting. But to Gene Simmons, that virtuosity bordered on self-indulgence. He has openly mocked progressive rock as music that impresses musicians while alienating regular listeners. From Gene's perspective, Rush prioritized intelligence over instinct. Their lyrics explored philosophy, science fiction, individualism, and abstract concepts rather than romance, rebellion, danger, or excess. Gene has often dismissed that approach as thinking too much, suggesting that rock should hit you in the gut, not challenge your brain. To him, rock isn't meant to be studied, it's meant to be felt. Personality only widened the gap. Geddy Lee has always been soft-spoken, introspective, and reserved, the polar opposite of Gene Simmons's bombastic, confrontational persona. Gene thrives on provocation. He courts controversy. He dominates interviews and stages alike. Geddy avoids confrontation entirely, letting the music speak for itself. That contrast alone made Rush feel like outsiders in Gene's definition of rock stardom. Gene has always acknowledged Rush's achievements, notwithstanding all of this. The group was maturing. They put in millions of records, went on unending tours, and created one of the most committed following groups of rock history, all to a large extent without having any radio singles or the backing of mainstream media. Their fans were with the band for a lifetime, experiencing it like almost a religious devotion. Yet, even this accomplishment did not completely win Gene over. He regarded the success that was gained through the means of traditional rock living as admirable though not exemplary. Gene frequently depicts progressive rock as music that is devoid of danger. It is also characterized by precision, control, and even a certain academic quality. The concerts of Rush were structured, professional, and executed with great care. Each note was played purposely. Each performance was similar. For Gene Simmons, this whole thing stripped away the excitement that comes from the risk involved in rock music. Geddy Lee did not pose a threat. Rather, he was merely impressive. However, in the case of Gene, those two aspects are different and not interchangeable. What really disturbs Gene's perspective the most is that clean rock and roll history showed him the other side. They proved that the union of creativity and stability could lead to great success. They established a huge rock and roll empire without things like scandals, excess, and shock. They did not have to pass through the storm to survive. They did not have to spend the light of controversy to keep their significance. And this fact quietly rattles the very foundation that Gene's rock needs to be built on. Still, Gene is not willing to give full credit, because if he were to accept Rush's way, then he would have to admit that rock does not need to be dumbed down to win over crowds. It can be clever, intricate, and heart-rending at the same time and still possess power. That restraint does not shoot down the enthusiasm, it merely alters its form. For the fans, Geddy Lee is the world's finest bassist ever, a musician who literally opened up the vocabulary of rock music. Gene Simmons is a mark of rock losing its primal beastly roots. Not necessarily a negative thing, just too clever for Gene's understanding of rock and roll. That clash was about brains over instinct. But the next one? It hits Gene on a much more personal level. Don't blink. Number 3. Sting to Gene Simmons. Few things are more irritating than a rock musician who appears embarrassed by rock itself. And in that sense, Sting has always represented a type of artist Gene instinctively distrusts. The bassist who didn't just want success, but transcendence. Someone who seemed eager to rise above the genre rather than live inside it. Sting's rise with the Police was undeniable. The band blended punk urgency, reggae rhythms, and sharp pop hooks into a sound that dominated the late 1970s and early 1980s. As a bassist, Sting wasn't flashy or aggressive, but he was melodic, controlled, and highly influential. His bass lines served the songs, often carrying the melody while keeping the groove tight. On paper, there was plenty Gene Simmons should have respected. But in Gene's world, respect isn't just about results. It's about attitude. And Sting's attitude often felt detached from rock's core instincts. Gene Simmons has frequently criticized what he calls art school intellectuals in rock musicians who treat the genre as something to outgrow rather than fully embrace. Sting, with his jazz influences, literary lyrics, classical training, and eventual pivot toward orchestral and world music, fit that profile perfectly. To Gene, it looked like Sting saw rock as a stepping stone instead of a destination. Not a lifelong commitment, but a phase to evolve beyond. The fact that Sting was both the bassist and frontman only intensified the issue. In Gene's philosophy, bass players are meant to support the structure, not lecture the audience. They are the foundation, not the voice of authority. Sting, however, wrote introspective lyrics, explored complex themes, and delivered them with calm precision. His controlled stage presence clashed directly with Gene's belief that rock should be loud, reckless, indulgent, and overflowing with danger. There was also a major tonal clash between the two men. Gene Simmons thrives on provocation, sexuality, spectacle, controversy, and excess. He believes rock should shock first and explain later. Sting, by contrast, cultivated seriousness. His songs tackled politics, religion, loneliness, morality, and global conflict. To Gene, that seriousness drained the rock of its primal energy. Rock wasn't supposed to educate, it was supposed to seduce, intimidate, and dominate. Sting was not completely free from Gene's skepticism even after the Police's enormous success. Just like they went without RCA's help, the band sold millions of records and turned into one of the top shows worldwide without shocking the public, with extraordinary stage acts or deliberate disputes. They were dressed modestly, performed precisely, and gave priority to musicianship. Gene acknowledged the numbers but still did not buy their way. For him, the victory without the glamour was of little value. The Police's split-up only deepened Gene's doubts. Rather than going for the rock and roll superstar's lifestyle, Sting opted for jazz with orchestration and patience. His solo career turned from unrefined anger to sophistication. To him, this move was a rejection, evidence that Sting had never completely accepted rock as an endgame. It was the proof that to Sting, rock was just a platform to be above rather than totally commit to. Gene has frequently presented his criticisms of Sting in such a way that they are not meant to be personal attacks, but rather philosophical disagreements. Within such a context, Sting becomes the bassist who turned his back on rock's simplest instincts to gain the elegance of jazz music. A musician who liked to be in control rather than in chaos, and to take the long way around rather than be exposed to danger, and who was more thoughtful than impulsive. What chiefly frustrates Gene is the proof of Sting's career that it is possible to achieve a great deal without going through the excesses. That influence can be through restraint. That rock can be the unheard shouting. These very truths slowly but surely erode Gene's conviction that shock and spectacle are the sine qua non of rock music. For rock fans, Sting is a genreless and unbounded artist who has evolved all the way up to a world-class artist. Gene Simmons is a mountain climber of rock that, once on top, looks down on it. And for Gene, nothing could be more repugnant than a fake rock and roll person who pretends to be the same. Number 2. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney may be one of the most respected bassists in music history, but in Gene Simmons's worldview, respect does not automatically equal agreement. When it comes to Paul, Gene's issue was never talent, it was philosophy. Two radically different ideas of what rock music is supposed to be, represent, and ultimately achieve. Gene Simmons has openly questioned the Beatles' legacy for years, often placing Elvis Presley above them in the rock hierarchy. That stance alone put him at odds with Paul McCartney, whose melodic bass playing didn't just support songs, it redefined how the bass functioned in popular music. Paul treated the bass as a voice, sometimes even a lead instrument. To Gene, that approach lacked force. Melody, in his mind, wasn't dominant, and dominance is what rock was meant to project. Paul McCartney's bass lines were thoughtful, emotional, and often understated. They flowed with the song rather than overpowering it, filling space with warmth and subtle direction. Gene Simmons's bass style, by contrast, was blunt, aggressive, and percussive. He used the bass like a weapon, simple, heavy, and commanding. Where Paul approached music as art and expression, Gene approached it as conquest and control. That contrast extended far beyond technique. It shaped how both men viewed success itself. Paul treated music as a creative journey, following inspiration even if it meant stepping away from the spotlight. Gene treated music as a scalable empire. Touring, merchandising, branding, and licensing weren't side projects. They were proof of victory. For Gene, success wasn't just influence. It was expansion. Leaving money on the table made no sense to Gene Simmons. Paul's willingness to step back from touring, avoid aggressive merchandising, or prioritize fulfillment over constant growth challenged Gene's definition of winning. In Gene's world, success must be maximized, measured, and monetized. Anything less feels unfinished. Gene has also criticized what he calls Beatles mythology, the belief that artistic purity should outweigh commercial dominance. Paul McCartney became the symbol of that idea, a bassist who valued emotion over aggression, beauty over spectacle, and restraint over excess. To Gene, that philosophy softened rock's edge. Rock, in his mind, is supposed to be dangerous, provocative, and confrontational. Even Paul's aversion to shock and controversy became a point of friction. Gene believes rock should offend, push boundaries, and demand attention. Paul soothed instead. His music invited rather than attacked. Where Gene embraced excess, Paul trusted songwriting, melody, and emotional connection. What unsettled Gene most was what Paul ultimately proved. He showed that cultural victory doesn't require constant domination, that longevity doesn't need endless controversy. That bass playing doesn't have to be aggressive to be powerful. Paul's influence endured not because he was the loudest, but because his music connected deeply. For Gene Simmons, that reality quietly challenges everything he believes about rock. Because if Paul's approach worked, and history says it did, then rock doesn't have to be loud, sexual, and confrontational to last. To fans, Paul McCartney is one of the greatest bassists who has ever lived. To Gene Simmons, he represents a road not taken, and one he never believed in, even when it led to undeniable greatness. You might not agree with that take, but the next one leaves no room for debate. Number 1. Sid Vicious. To Gene Simmons, Sid Vicious wasn't just a bad bassist. He was the collapse of everything rock music was supposed to stand for. While punk fans embraced Sid as a raw symbol of rebellion and anti-establishment fury, Gene saw something far less romantic. Chaos without competence, noise without purpose, and destruction without direction. Gene Simmons has always believed that rebellion still requires skill. Shock, in his view, should be calculated. Provocation should be earned. Controversy should be backed by ability. Rock music isn't accidental, it's engineered. Sid Vicious, in Gene's eyes, failed every one of those tests. His bass playing was famously limited, sometimes non-existent. Stories of Sid being unplugged on stage, buried in the mix, or replaced in the studio became part of rock folklore. To Gene, that wasn't punk authenticity, it was fraud disguised as honesty. What bothered Gene most wasn't simply that Sid couldn't play well, it was that he didn't seem to care. Gene has openly mocked the idea that attitude alone is enough to justify success. In his worldview, effort matters. Discipline matters. Mastery matters. Sid became the ultimate example of what Gene despised. A movement that celebrated destruction over discipline and image over substance. Punk didn't just lower the bar in Gene's eyes. Sid dragged it to the floor. Where Gene believed rock music should dominate culture, command attention, control the narrative, and build something lasting, Sid seemed intent on burning everything down without replacing it. There was no long-term vision, no interest in growth, no concern for legacy. Everything was immediate, self-destructive, and terminal. To Gene Simmons, that wasn't rebellion. It was surrender, disguised as resistance. There was also a deep philosophical divide between the two men. Gene viewed rock musicians as leaders, figures who project power, confidence, control, and ambition both on stage and off. Sid Vicious projected nihilism. He rejected responsibility, authority, and even self-preservation. He didn't want longevity. He didn't want mastery. In Gene's mind, that rejection disqualified Sid from being taken seriously as a musician or role model. The rapid rise of the Sex Pistols only deepened Gene's resentment. To him, the band proved a dangerous idea. That controversy could outweigh competence and chaos could beat craft. Sid became famous not for what he played, but for what he destroyed. His image, his relationships, his health, and ultimately, his life. Gene Simmons often talks about responsibility, not just to fans, but to the music itself. In that sense, Sid Vicious represented the opposite of everything Gene tried to build with Kiss. Where Gene engineered shock with control, Sid embodied shock without restraint. One built for longevity, the other embraced collapse. To fans, Sid Vicious remains punk mythology, a raw, chaotic symbol of rebellion frozen in time. To Gene Simmons, he was proof that rebellion without skill, discipline, or purpose doesn't lead to freedom. It leads nowhere. Gene Simmons never pretended to like everyone, and age didn't soften his views. To him, bass isn't about standing out, it's about holding the band together. These 7 bassists crossed lines Gene never believed should be crossed. Agree with him or not, one thing is certain. Gene has always played by his own rules. Now it's your turn. Do you agree or disagree? Drop a comment. Hit like. Subscribe for more rock stories and watch the next video on your screen.